There is a moment that happens in the life of many empaths that is rarely dramatic on the outside. Nobody hears thunder. No music begins playing in the background. There is no obvious event that announces it, but internally something shifts. And it usually starts with exhaustion, not physical exhaustion, the kind that sleep fixes. It is emotional exhaustion, the exhaustion that comes from spending years translating your inner world for people who were never truly trying to understand it. Many empaths become experts in emotional translation very early in life. They learn to explain what they mean before anyone asks. They explain their tone, explain their intentions, explain why something hurt them, explain why they reacted the way they did, and over time this becomes automatic. They stop realizing they are even doing it. Now the question is, where does that come from? Because people assume this behavior comes from kindness alone. They say, well, empaths just care deeply. That is part of it, but it is not the entire story. Human behavior rarely exists on a single level. Beneath almost every repeated behavior is a hidden survival strategy. For many people, especially those with anxious attachment patterns or emotionally inconsistent childhood environments, understanding people became a form of safety. They learned to read rooms before entering them. They learned to notice small changes in expressions, posture, and tone. They became emotionally hyper-aware because missing a signal carried consequences. When a child grows up in uncertainty, they begin asking unconscious questions. What does this person need from me? How do I keep peace? How do I avoid rejection? How do I stay connected? Over years, this can create an identity around emotional management. The empath becomes the person who smooths conflict, explains misunderstandings, and repairs emotional distance. But here is where things become complicated. What begins as emotional intelligence can slowly become emotional overfunctioning. There is a difference. Emotional intelligence says, I understand emotions. Emotional overfunctioning says, I am responsible for everyone else's emotions. Those are not the same thing. The empath often starts carrying conversations that were never theirs to carry. They explain their pain repeatedly to people who continue repeating the same behaviors. They clarify themselves over and over again. They search for the perfect combination of words, believing that if they can just explain themselves correctly, everything will finally make sense. And that belief is powerful because it feels logical. If misunderstanding hurts, then greater explanation should create greater understanding. Except life does not always work that way. Because understanding is not created by better explanations alone. Understanding also requires willingness. It requires presence. It requires someone who actually wants to hear what is being said. You cannot force emotional insight into someone who is committed to avoiding it. Think about how much energy gets spent trying to unlock closed doors. The empath keeps changing the angle, changing the approach, changing the language. Softer words, stronger words, more patience, more understanding, more effort. And eventually something strange happens. The empath notices that they are speaking more and being understood less. That realization changes everything, because they begin recognizing that explanation has become a cycle rather than a bridge. They are no longer communicating, they are chasing, and chasing creates exhaustion. The deepest lesson is not that people never understand you. The deepest lesson is that understanding cannot be dragged out of someone through effort alone. At some point, emotional intelligence matures into something quieter, something stronger. It realizes that not every misunderstanding is an invitation to explain yourself again. Sometimes it is simply information. The moment you stop translating your soul for people committed to misunderstanding, it is the moment your energy finally comes home. After that exhaustion sets in, something begins to change in the empath's internal world. And for many people, this change looks confusing from the outside because others often misinterpret it. They think the empath has become colder, more distant, less caring. They assume silence means anger, withdrawal, or emotional shutdown. But internally, something entirely different is happening. The empath is beginning to understand a distinction that most people spend their entire lives missing. They are discovering that emotional intelligence is not measured by how much emotion you can carry. It is measured by how wisely you decide where that emotion belongs. For years, they believed emotional intelligence meant constant engagement. Stay patient. Keep listening. Keep explaining. Keep understanding. If conflict appears, solve it. If someone feels misunderstood, help them feel seen. If there is tension, repair it. And on the surface, these sound like admirable qualities. They often are. But any strength taken beyond its healthy boundary begins transforming into its opposite. Patience without limits becomes self-neglect. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-sacrifice. Understanding without discernment becomes emotional surrender. Many empaths eventually discover that they have been confusing availability with wisdom. Think about the difference. Availability says, I will always be here no matter what. Wisdom says, I will be here where mutual respect exists. Those are not the same thing. Because there is a hidden danger in believing that emotional intelligence requires constant access to your energy. People begin unconsciously expecting you to absorb confusion, regulate tension, and carry emotional weight that belongs to them. And the strange part is that many empaths participate in this dynamic without realizing it. Why? Because silence feels uncomfortable. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty activates old fears. If someone becomes distant, explain more. If there is conflict, fix it immediately. If someone misunderstands your intentions, clarify them again. But silence removes control. You cannot manage another person's perception when you stop speaking. You cannot steer their reactions. You cannot continuously reshape how they see you, and that loss of control feels dangerous at first. Human beings naturally fear empty spaces. We rush to fill pauses in conversations. We rush to resolve tension. We rush to defend ourselves against assumptions. We feel compelled to do something because action creates the illusion of security. But emotionally mature people eventually discover something important. Not every silence is empty. Some silences are speaking constantly. Silence reveals things words often hide. It reveals who respects your boundaries and who only respects your usefulness. It reveals who seeks understanding and who only seeks agreement. It reveals who becomes curious and who becomes uncomfortable when they are no longer receiving constant emotional access. When the empath stops rushing into every emotional fire, people begin showing their patterns more clearly, and this is where silent power begins emerging. Silent power is not punishment. Silent power is not passive aggression. Silent power is not disappearing to manipulate someone into chasing you. Those behaviors still revolve around control. Silent power is something very different. It is the ability to remain emotionally centered without needing to convince, defend, or rescue. It is sitting comfortably with misunderstanding when clarification would only create another cycle. It is recognizing that endless explanations do not always create connection. It is understanding that your value does not increase because someone finally approves of you. For years, the empath believed strength meant carrying more. Now they begin learning that strength sometimes means carrying less. And people around them notice it immediately. Because the person who once rushed to fill every silence now simply observes. They listen more carefully. They react less impulsively. They stop spending energy proving what should not need proof. And that changes the entire emotional atmosphere around them. Because the loudest presence in a room is not always the person speaking. Sometimes it is the person who no longer needs to. Silence becomes power the moment you stop using your voice to seek permission and start using it with intention. Once silence begins replacing constant explanation, another realization starts appearing beneath the surface. And this realization is uncomfortable because it forces the empath to look inward rather than outward. Up to this point, attention has mostly been focused on other people, what they feel, what they need, why they act the way they do. Empaths become incredibly skilled at reading external worlds, but eventually a deeper question emerges. Why do I feel such a strong need to be understood in the first place? Because there is a difference between wanting to be understood and needing to be understood. One is human. The other can become a psychological survival strategy. Most people assume attachment styles only affect romantic relationships. They think attachment begins when attraction begins. But attachment starts much earlier than that. It begins in environments where the nervous system is learning the rules of connection. Long before people understand language, they are studying emotional patterns. They are asking unconscious questions. Is closeness safe? Is love stable? Do I need to perform for connection? Do I have to become something for people to stay? The mind remembers answers even when the conscious memory does not. For many empaths, especially those with anxious or inconsistent attachment experiences, love became associated with attentiveness. They learned that paying close attention created emotional safety. They learned to monitor moods, anticipate reactions, and adjust themselves accordingly. Think about what that does to a person over time. A child who repeatedly experiences emotional unpredictability often becomes extraordinarily observant. They notice tiny changes in expression, a different tone of voice, a pause that lasts a second too long, a shift in body language. Most people call this sensitivity, but often it began as adaptation. Adaptation is important because human beings are designed for survival. We develop strategies based on the environments around us. The problem is that survival strategies do not disappear automatically when circumstances change. The nervous system keeps using old maps even when standing in new territory. So the empath enters adulthood carrying invisible rules. If I understand people deeply enough, they will stay. If I explain myself perfectly, I will avoid rejection. If I become emotionally valuable, I will be loved. None of these beliefs usually exist at the conscious level. People do not wake up in the morning saying these things to themselves. Instead, these beliefs operate quietly beneath awareness, directing behavior from the background. And this is where explaining becomes more than communication. It becomes protection. Because if misunderstanding once felt connected to emotional loss, then being understood starts feeling necessary for security. Now suddenly every disagreement feels larger than it is. Every emotional distance feels threatening. Every unresolved conversation feels dangerous. The empath becomes trapped in an endless pursuit, not simply trying to communicate, but trying to create certainty. And certainty is seductive because uncertainty feels vulnerable. But there is a difficult truth here. No amount of explanation can eliminate the uncertainty that exists inside human relationships. People will misunderstand you. People will project their own fears onto you. People will interpret your intentions through their own experiences. And no amount of emotional effort can completely control that reality. Healing begins when the empath understands something profound. Being misunderstood is not automatically abandonment. Read that again. Because many people spend years reacting to misunderstanding as though connection itself is disappearing. But disagreement is not rejection. Distance is not always abandonment. Someone failing to understand you does not reduce your worth. And once this realization settles in, the entire emotional landscape begins changing. The need to constantly explain begins softening. The urgency begins disappearing. The fear begins losing its grip. Because for the first time, the empath stops asking, "How do I make them understand me?" and starts asking, "Why do I need their understanding to feel whole?" That question changes everything. The moment you stop earning love through explanation is the moment you discover that your existence never required permission to matter, and this is where the shift becomes visible. Up to this point, the changes have mostly been internal. The empath has become tired of translating every feeling. They have discovered that silence can carry more intelligence than endless explanations. They have begun recognizing the attachment wounds underneath the constant need to be understood. But now something happens that cannot stay hidden. The change starts entering every relationship around them. And this is where people become confused, because human relationships operate on patterns. Most people think they are responding to personalities, but very often they are responding to roles. Every relationship unconsciously creates expectations. One person becomes the listener, one becomes the fixer, one becomes the pursuer, one becomes the emotional caretaker. The empath frequently becomes the regulator of emotional space. They notice tension before others notice it. They smooth conflict before it escalates. They initiate difficult conversations. They explain misunderstandings. They absorb emotional pressure and convert it into peace. And if someone plays that role long enough, people begin expecting it without realizing it, not because people are necessarily manipulative. Most of the time, it is simpler than that. Human beings adapt to patterns very quickly. If a light switch turns on every time you press it, eventually you stop thinking about the process. You simply expect the result. The same thing happens emotionally. If the empath has always been the one reaching out first, calming tension first, apologizing first, understanding first, people begin assuming that rhythm will continue forever. Then one day it stops, and suddenly the silence feels loud. The person who always explained no longer explains. The person who always chased clarity no longer chases it. The person who carried the emotional weight sets it down. And people notice immediately. Some become curious. Some become uncomfortable. Some become frustrated. Because the absence of a familiar pattern forces people to confront something they never had to confront before, their own contribution to the dynamic. This is important because silence acts like a mirror. When constant emotional effort disappears, reality becomes easier to see. Relationships that were built on mutual care often become stronger. Respect grows because both people begin sharing responsibility for connection. But relationships built upon imbalance react differently, because imbalance survives through dependency. If one person has always carried 80% of the emotional work, the system depends on that person continuing to do it. Once they stop, the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. And this is why the empath sometimes feels guilt during this stage. They think, maybe I have become selfish. Maybe I have become distant. Maybe I am changing too much. But protecting your energy is not selfishness. Boundaries often feel selfish only to people who benefited from your lack of them. That statement matters because many empaths spent years believing that love meant endless access, endless patience, endless understanding, endless availability. But mature love operates differently. Healthy relationships do not require one person to disappear so another person can remain comfortable. Healthy relationships create space for two realities, two voices, two emotional responsibilities. And the empath begins noticing something they had never seen clearly before. Their power was never hidden inside constant giving. It was hidden inside choice. Choice changes everything, because now they are not helping because they fear losing people. They are helping because they genuinely want to. They are not staying because they fear abandonment. They are staying because the connection deserves it. They are not explaining because silence scares them. They are speaking because their words have meaning, and there is a calmness that enters a person when they arrive here. Not loud confidence, not arrogance, not emotional detachment, something quieter, something stronger. The understanding that your presence becomes most powerful the moment it is no longer driven by fear. The greatest shift in an empath's life is not when they learn to speak louder. It is when they discover that peace no longer needs an audience.